if I could give you three ideas, just three ideas that would help you rewire your organization and your culture to value the collective intelligence of your team, would you be interested? Well, if your answer is yes, you're in the right place. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow both personally and professionally so they can lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you're listening to this podcast, you could join us in the future live so that on your favorite social media channels so that you can get the information that we have here earlier. You can't do that for this one, but you can in the future. The way to find out when those are happening so you can join us live, ask your questions, and get even more value would be to join our Facebook or LinkedIn groups where all of that information is shared and are a couple of the places where they're actually streamed. So you can join our Facebook group at remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or our LinkedIn group at remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Pretty straightforward. So today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Masterclasses, picked from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become more effective, productive, and confident while overcoming some of a leader's toughest challenges. Learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now it's time for me to bring in our guest. Let me bring him in, and there he is. Let me introduce him, and then we will dive in. You now see in front of you, or are about ready to hear from, Gene Kim. He was the founder and CTO of Tripwire Inc. for 13 years, an enterprise security software company. In 2014, he launched DevOps Enterprise Summit, an annual event that has attracted over 10,000 technology leaders to date. He has spoken at over 100 companies and conferences, including Apple, Target, IBM, Nike, Principal Financial, Lululemon, and Microsoft. His books have sold over, get this, everybody, 1 million copies. That puts him in rare company. He has authored the widely acclaimed book, The Unicorn Project, co-authored several influential works, including The Phoenix Project, The DevOps Handbook, and the award-winning Accelerate, which received the prestigious Shingo Publication Award. His latest book is that he's the co-author of Wiring the Winning Organization. Here it is. I'll say it again so I get it right again. Wiring the Winning Organization. Gene, welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.
Kevin, I'm so delighted to be here, and congratulations on the 418th episode. You've had such an amazing cast.
You are number 418. That is correct. Before we started, Gene asked me hard questions, and I said, "Wait a minute, the hard questions need to be for you, Gene."
No,
I'm just teasing. So listen, we'll get into the book in a second, but I'm always interested to learn a little bit more about the journey. Obviously, I read a bit of your bio for everybody, but my question is a little different. Like, how do you end up here? Like, you didn't probably expect that when you were a 10-year-old that you were going to be a million copy book author or anything along those lines, or doing the work that you're doing. You probably couldn't even describe the work that you're doing when you were 10. Like, how do you end up here? Tell us just a little bit about the journey outside of the bio.
Yeah, I grew up as privileged enough to, with computers, and so that was in the late 70s, early 80s, and I ended up working at a halftime at a software company. It was actually acquired by Sun Microsystems, and I was doing that halftime while I was in high school. And around November 2nd, 1988, was the first massive computer virus worm, where essentially 10% of all the servers on the internet were taken down because of a rogue piece of code that escaped Bell Labs and by Robert Morris Jr. Anyway, so the person that was doing the most work and really understanding computer security at the time was Dr. Gene Spafford at Purdue University, and so I ended up going there like you.
So that
yes,
makes me happy to hear the Boilermakers repped on the show.
In fact, and so that actually led me to apply and get into Purdue University in the middle of the cornfields of Indiana. So had I known,
I didn't know that we're both Boilermakers.
Right? Yeah. So, and so that actually led to an independent study project where I got to work on, what would it take for computer systems operators to be able to get earlier detection, better enable them to recover and ideally prevention. And so I spent the first 10 years of my life in computer security, but I guess something was bothering me was that, when I later founded a company to commercialize that technology. The best company that had the best, security and posture compliance, uh, it wasn't actually didn't seem to determine on how good the security leader was. In fact, it was like how good the operations leader was. It's and so my the kind of dawning realization was that, oh, the best operations, the best uptime and availability in, people who ran websites like the New York Stock Exchange or Akamai, or the people who became the tech giants, you know uh that their success actually depended on how good was their working relationship with the information security function. And it turns out, what I learned 10 years after that, we were marching into the 2010s, was that, oh, the best technology organizations, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, they were, what was most important was how good was the developers' working relationship with operations and the information security function. And so, that really kind of launched me into my 25-year journey studying high performing technology organizations, where, you ask the question, what makes a great organizations great? Where they can ship projects and features on time. They can actually run in operations scalably without crashing, and they're not being mown down by hackers or malicious code, which is we see all too often in the news. And so that
So
is
so
really one
worry
of the hobby
not,
spending.
everybody. So worry not, everybody. This is not going to be an episode just if you happen to be in a technology company. Even though that's where Gene grew up and where Gene has just been talking about, this conversation, I'm confident, because I know from the book that while that's Gene's background, that's not the real focus of this book. Fair?
Absolutely. Right. But there's this common theme that it is around crossing boundaries and functional silos. That, I think when you look at, the Navy SEALs, right? It's not just about how good the Navy SEALs are, it's about how good and effective are they operating with the other divisions, inside of special operations and SOCOM. You see this within hospitals, right? It's not about how good the doctors are, it's how good are they at interacting across nursing, pharmacy, supply chain, and so forth. And so, I think that is really the universal truth of great leaders. They can integrate those functions well. How am I
It,
doing?
no, that's fantastic. So I want us to talk about there. This is, I will tell everybody that of the books that I've read for the show this year, I've read probably thicker ones, uh, but I don't know that I've read any denser ones. And I don't mean that in a negative way. There's a tremendous amount of depth in this book, and there's no way, Gene, that we can talk about everything in it. That would be true for every episode, I realize, but that's really true here for me today. So what I want to do is pull out some things for us to talk about that I think are some of the key ideas that any of us could start to apply. And in some cases, what you can do is help people see some things in ways they may not have seen them before. You were just hinting at a second ago what I think is one of the most useful things in the book. It provides a way to think about this that maybe many people haven't. You talk about there being three layers to
Yeah.
work,
Oh,
that
yeah.
there's three kinds of parts to the work. You were hinting at this a second ago. So why don't you talk about those three layers a little bit and help us understand why they're useful for us to think
Yeah.
about the work that way.
Absolutely. So the first layer is around, well, whenever someone's working, there's an object that we're trying to expose direct our skills and knowledge on. So that could be the code that we're working on, or the system in production, or the material in front of us that we need to transform. And there's a second layer, which is something we're doing that through tools, right, and technologies. And so that is a second layer. And so though that's the technical parts of the socio-technical system. Layer three is what we call the social circuitry. This is this is the socio part of the socio-technical system. And it turns out that in my research, and that research of Dr. Stephen Spear at the MIT Sloan School of Business, who studied the Toyota production system, he wrote one of the seminal papers in 1999. He studied aerospace safety culture and at Alcoa, and helped build it. And our common to really boil it down, I come from software. He comes from everything but software. Our common area of marvel is that what makes great organizations has nothing to do with technology. It's part of it, but the real common part of great organizations and great leaders is that they focus on the layer three, the socio parts of the socio-technical systems. What are the things required to integrate all those separate functional specialties towards a common purpose? And if I can share one example, is that
Absolutely.
here here's a great example of like when you have a layer three system that is failing. And I'll be blunt, right? This is the responsibility and the failure of leadership. Suppose you have a large telco, and all they want to do is put a a checkbox in front of their 20 million customers, and so they can subscribe to email services, net movies, and this will take $28 million. It will take 1 year to complete. It requires CEO minus one level support of daily war room meetings, because it has to transit across 40 different teams. When you ask most people, what's the likelihood of it succeeding, they'll say one in five, right? 20%,
At best.
because it didn't work the first two times. And the point is, this is not a technically challenging problem. This is not a layer one, layer two daunting problem. This is all because the coordination function of the organization is the opposite of what is needed. This is the responsibility of the leaders to help people do their work easily and well. And so I
Well,
love
so I and lots of other people like me, you may have said the same thing, say that one of the jobs of a leader is to remove the barriers from people to get their work done. So it is, you're nodding with me. So that's true. Is that a lot of what you're saying here, or is that just a small part of what you're saying here?
Yeah, I think it's. Well, I mean, I think that is probably one of those fundamental principles, and it sounds like a platitude, right? The job of leadership is to allow people to do their work easily and well, and yet it has profound implications. And so, when people say that they're fighting bureaucracies, or they have hardships, or they're working in places of genuine danger, or they don't have time to improve, I mean, those are all things that leaders are doing wrong. That is preventing people from doing their work easy and well. In fact, maybe I should add another one: safely, right? To be able to do their work and not get hurt and not damage the
Yeah.
equipment themselves and so forth.
Yeah, I love that. So the one of the early things that you talk about in the book, and it goes throughout, is this idea of these three layers. And in many ways, if we're talking about a book called "Wiring the Winning Organization," it's probably not surprising that we're going to spend the book spends its time talking mostly about that third layer, that socio layer,
Yeah.
if you will. And one of the things that we find ourselves dealing with in organizations all of the time are problems. And you talk about problems and problem solving as taking place in one of kind of two zones. And I think this will be an idea, again, putting some language on things that maybe help people see things better or differently. You talk about there being two problem solving zones. So why don't you lay those out and maybe give us an example or two?
Yeah, for sure. And I would just kind of lead up to this one by saying, kind of imagine the conditions, the worst case conditions to solve an important problem for the organization and the customer. But how could we make it like really, really difficult for ourselves? One is like you don't have time to think. You can't undo, right? Any error gets magnified and causes global catastrophe. You can make the problem so that you really can't solve them by yourselves, but you have to solve it with 20,000 of your best friends in parallel. And any mistake they make will impact you and vice versa. So I would say those are and make it not obvious when something goes wrong, right? You don't learn till 6 hours later. So I'd say kind of
Or 5 minutes before, right?
oh, for sure, right,
I'm
exactly.
thinking about your example of our fellow Boilermaker when he's getting ready to land on
Oh,
the
holy
moon, right?
cow,
That's
yeah.
what so as an example, right?
Exactly. So those are, what we're calling danger zone characteristics. And so, yeah, let's go into, what can leaders do to make sure that, problem solving, where learning can actually happen, because learning is experiential, experimental. So one thing leaders can do is make sure that we can do things in planning and practice. When you're doing things that are highly consequential, like let's make sure that first time we try to rescue the hostages, that is not in the performance environment. Let's be able to do drills, be able to uh, learn our mistakes in the non-performance environment. Let's be able to, so that's, slowing things down. We can divide up the problem so that, we can work on just our parts of the problem, and mistakes stay local as opposed to causing everyone else hardship and grief. And, another thing that we can do is like make it super, super obvious, when things are going wrong, so that we can either, call a timeout. Could have been useful for our Boilermaker friends.
Yeah.
Um, so we could change plays. And we want to make it super obvious, that you want as many, shots on goal as possible, so that by the time we are, it really matters that we've made all our mistakes. We have the muscle memories, that we can bring that to bear and ideally win.
It's interesting you use the phrase timeout, because one of the things, I mean, in the book you use a lot of important, useful business examples. You've hinted at a couple, but I think that one of the things Listen, I know that some people that are listening are sports fans and some are not. And so I'm always careful with sports analogies because I don't want to alienate people for whom it doesn't matter much. But I will say this, that if you are a sports fan, one of the things that you will note is that you are rooting for or against people that are doing a tremendous amount of practicing, way more than we are doing in most cases.
Mhm.
Most of us find ourselves going in and now we're going to figure it out. Now we're going to wing it, or we think we've got some idea. Like there's a difference between um, having some experience and having truly practiced it uh,
Yeah.
in significant ways. Again, I won't go any further down the sports rabbit hole, even though I could. I think that's a really important point. And the two things we can take from sports, number one is that even the very best players have coaches and they all practice.
Yeah.
You want to say any more
Yeah.
about it?
Yeah. In
You're
fact,
talking about to further the sports analogy, you're talking about the difference between the danger zone and the winning zone, right? So,
absolutely.
so go
Yeah,
ahead.
and Dr. Steve Spear, he's more of a sports fan than I am. But I mean, one of the things that I actually was really interested in is that if you look at the most remarkable sports teams, not only did they do a lot of what looks like a miracle, at the at the end zone, at the with only minutes to go. In general, those were rehearsed and often rehearsed in smaller areas of play in faster tempo operations so that when it really matters, they had those muscle memory and routines. It turns out that's exactly what happened in the Apollo space program, where by the time, Apollo 11 is they're executing their landing, all the things that went wrong, and there were many, all of those were actually rehearsed in simulations. Simulations served as such a crucial mechanism to make sure that, in fact, the simulation supervisor group, their job was to make sure the astronauts were ready. They challenged the astronauts and mission control to handle scenarios that they never thought of, to make sure that their mistakes were made long before they were, say, 6,000 feet above the lunar surface. And maybe just to jump ahead a little bit, we call that slowification. We had to make up a word because there was no one word in English that captured that notion of you have to slow down to speed up. And there were many adages like, stop sawing to sharpen the saw, or slow is smooth, smooth is fast. But there was not one word. And we felt it was like so important because if you can't say it, then you might not be able to think it. And so we thought that let's give it a name, and it will be very familiar. But we're hoping that this new verb might be able to help people trigger kind of slowification actions where we say, all right, let's pause. This is something that we don't want to learn in production. We need to hone our skills, in planning and practice.
So, yeah, I love that, and I think you're exactly right that having a word
Mm.
changes everything, right? Like, if so often the light bulb goes off for us when we hear a word in another language that we don't quite have a word for. And that's what you've done is you've labeled something that we can sort of see, but it becomes far more concrete once you've given it. So at the top of the show, Gene, I suggested that I would give people three specific things that they could do, and this is the first of those three things, which is slowification. So we've talked about this as it relates to planning and practice, but what specific ideas can a leader leave this conversation with while they're clicking on Amazon to order their copy of the book, Wiring the Winning Organization? Like, what can they do
Yeah.
now for themselves or with their team? And maybe you want to answer those separately
Oh no.
to do a better job of slowifying.
Yeah, in fact, I would say for the team. In fact, what leaders can do for their team is say, "Hey, look, whenever you run into difficulties, hardships, whenever you are working around a problem in production and performance, uh, we should call a flag on the play." Right, and if we can't, we have to develop the procedure. We have to know what the right thing to do is. And there was a study that I found very heartbreaking. There's a case study of Miss Morris versus Miss Morrison in the hospital, where the wrong patient got a surgical procedure done, despite 14 pieces of evidence that, like, including the patient saying you've got the wrong person. I'm laughing, but it's not funny. It's tragic. Where in a better world, right? Each one of those should have been a signal that said, all right, we have lost track of what's going around us. We don't know what to do, and the worst thing to do is plow forward. So
Right.
what leaders should do is say, all right, ideally, while it's happening, what should happen? so that we can clarify what's happening. Let's make sure there's another procedure or a sentinel so that we can detect, ideally correct, better yet prevent. And if we can't do it in the performance environment, well, then at the end of shift and in a week, right, let's figure out how we can create a deflection so these horrendous things don't happen again. And so obviously part of that is the leader has to make it safe, expected, so that when problems come up, we don't suppress those signals. We have to amplify those signals, and we can be able to do that equivalent of timeout. Something's wrong. Something's not what I expect. You know, uh, and this is a team sport. How do we change our play?
I love. So first of all, detect, correct, and prevent, really useful language. But the thing that I want to make sure people are highlighting in their mind, if they're, while you're listening to this podcast, whatever you might be doing, is the idea of that in order for us to create this slowing down step, we have to, as leaders, make it safe for people to slow it down. We
Yeah,
have to say that this is the expectation, not go, 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 not accelerator to the floor, but rather to say that we'll be more productive
yeah.
if we will slow down. Less is more, slow is fast,
Yep.
all those other adages. But I love you connecting this to the idea of we as leaders must make it safe for people to do that. And many of us, I will say us, are leaders in part because we have a sense of urgency and have become successful because of our sense of urgency. And we must recognize the value, Gene, of what you're saying and start to overcome it for ourselves, but help our teams do it as well.
Absolutely right. And they may seem mutually contradictory, but yet, I mean, we all know as leaders who have to live with our decisions that sometimes you have to make a short term investment to make a longer term gain. And if our job is to enable our people to do their work easily and well, then we also have to be listening for these signals that say, hey, look, something is wrong. I want to help make this better in the long term. And I think we just need to. I'm hoping that this word slow. We need to slowify. Will sort of trigger sometimes a better response from our leaders.
I love that. And I always, having done, as you said, now 418 of these, um, yeah, I always try to take one thing that I can really lock into my brain from an episode. And sometimes I have that figured out before we start from having read the book and doing my preparation. Sometimes not. I think that will be the one, this idea of slowifying, because while it was clear to me while I read, it's become more clear to me as we've talked about it. So I appreciate that. But there are two more besides slowification. The next one is simplification. What do you mean there?
Yeah, so slowification is all about moving or problem solving from places that are more amenable to solving difficult problems. So not in performance, but in planning and practice. Simplification is all about making the problems easier to solve. So some problems are super difficult to solve when they're highly intertwined. So that if you have 100 people working on a problem, every person's actions can impact everyone else. Problems are super hard when we try to do everything all at once, and things are super hard when we don't understand kind of how our work fits into the greater whole. And so simplification really, there's really three ways we can sort of do things in a more incremental way. So solve it in small little batches, and a lot of software development is now hinged on that. There's two kind of really special ways that you can do things. You can modularize them. In other words, the checkbox project that I described before, where wouldn't it be great if teams would work more independently? The problem with that $28 million put a checkbox in front of 40 different teams is that everyone's work is intertangled together and no one can work independently. So we've lost our ability to have independence of action. And so in software, in hardware systems, there's ways to divide up the work where we say, all right, here's the interfaces between teams. And once we agree on the interfaces, now we can now work independently. And so a famous example is the Amazon re-architecture in the early 2000s, where they could not ship features fast enough. And they went from hundreds of features and feature shipments per year to maybe tens. And by creating a more modular system, they were able to eventually do 136,000 per day, which is kind of this astonishing
It is
ability.
astonishing.
Yeah.
When I read that, I had to read it again, like a day, right?
Yeah. So it just shows how good the difference between good and great is vast. And then so this is all about liberating and creating independence of action between teams so they can work in parallel. And I'll just there's a separate technique where you can do that for sequential processes like the Toyota production system, where astonishingly, what makes the Toyota production system so remarkable is that they can do scores of line side changes per day. They can ship multiple model years within the same shift, and it's because that by creating these boundaries between people who are working in sequence, you create independence of action for them. And so one of the most famous examples is this kind of astonishing fact that in a typical Toyota plant for decades, they have this andon cord, and when something goes wrong, they pull the andon cord that halts that line segment. And most people would be shocked to learn that in a typical plant, the andon cord is pulled 5,000 times a day, which is so counterintuitive because like why are you doing something so disruptive so frequently? And it's because one, they're able to do it because you can actually halt one segment without affecting everybody else. But if you need to halt the whole line, you do because slowification. It's better to fix a problem early and often than wait till the end of the model year, and now you have potentially millions of cars that are all defective.
Now you got recalls, right?
Now you have
Uh,
recalls, exactly.
so slowification, simplification, and then lastly, amplification.
Yeah, amplification. So the definition of amplification is we have to create the management system. And by the way, let's be clear. Layer three is all about the management system that leaders create within their part of the system. And some of you might be the management system is the entire organization. Uh, the management system when you amplify is that small, even the weakest signals of failure are amplified so that we can act upon them decisively to better prevent, detect, correct um, early and often, as opposed to creating a management system where weak signals of failure are suppressed or even extinguished entirely, which is maybe I'll just say I've been parts of my career I've been systems like that, and they're horrible. And as leaders, we are responsible for the norms within the systems that we create.
Yeah, I love that. So, um, we've covered a lot of ground in a short time, Gene. Is there anything that we didn't touch on? Anything that you think we should talk about that we haven't?
Yeah, my favorite case study for amplification was one of the biggest aha moments, and it was the Southwest Airlines holiday crisis, where Winter Storm Elliott comes in, and every airline's canceling thousands of flights, but something odd happens around day three, which is every airline starts coming to normal operations except for Southwest Airlines, and the reason is that um, the crew scheduling system, where at the end of the day, every pilot that's in the wrong place has to call the crew scheduling office and tell them where they are. The problem is they can't get through. They have hold times of hours, even scores of hours. And in my mind, this was and it took them a week to basically reboot the
Unravel it
system.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, and to me, this was such an incredible metaphor of what happens when the management system cannot keep up with the environment they're operating in. In other words, they had to stop, basically stop operations, right, to get planes in the right place. And I think there are many situations where we as leaders and we as teams find ourselves where the management system cannot keep up with the world around us. And the Southwest Airlines one is another great example. Signals couldn't get to where they need to go, and they couldn't get the pieces to go where they should go. And I think as for everyone, I'm hoping that serves as a kind of a vivid example that isn't like a typical leadership story, but should trigger some memories of like, oh, here's what's happening. This is the communication coordination function is not adequate to what it was tasked to do, and that's a layer three function. And as leaders, we're responsible.
That is true. So we've been talking about the layers and solving problems and simplification and slowification and amplification, but I want to talk about you before we finish.
Uh,
So my question is, uh, Gene, what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? After coming off writing a book, I'm finding myself doing a lot of reading. I love coding just because you can solve so many problems that you struggle with without help from anyone else. And so that is my guilty pleasure. I'm trying to get my kids. We're going to write a game over the holidays. We've been talking about it for years, and I really want to take the time to spend just 3 days. Let's see if we can write a game together. And so that's something I'm uh, just super excited to do.
Now, That is the first time I've ever had someone on the show tell me that. Well, for fun, and my kids and I are going to write a game. There you have it, everybody. Um, so we've got slowification, simplification, amplification, and now gamification. How about that?
Absolutely.
You did mention reading, and you and I talked about this before we started the show. Um, uh, so what's something that you're reading, Gene, or have read recently?
I'm actually reading this academic paper from Dr. Vernon Richardson. He's the head of the accounting department at the Sal Walton School of Accounting at the University of Arkansas, and he wrote this paper 20 years ago that basically studied CEOs, who had you know clean financial reports, material weaknesses, and material weaknesses with an IT component. And what's so remarkable is that he compared those firms with uh, clean financial reports versus those that had material weaknesses with an IT component. And the punchline is that the CEOs in that third category were fired at a rate 8 times higher than the clean firms. The CFOs are fired at a rate 4 times higher. And so what's remarkable is that you don't read the Wall Street Journal and hear about CEOs being fired for these IT issues, and yet that's what is evident in his research. And I guess the reason why I bring it up is that um, he actually studied what for the CEOs who were fired, what was the next job? And he found that the CEOs, their next job was often in smaller firms or at a more less senior role. And it just for me, it just really caught my attention. I just really want to restudy that paper because it says leadership matters, not just to the organization that we're currently serving, but if you screw it up, this actually affects your own career because you will find that your job is not tackling bigger problems with less oversight. Your next job is going to be tackling smaller problems with more oversight. And I think there's a just that shows that there is, I guess, a just. The world works in just ways, but Leadership matters, right? Is a common conclusion that we both come to in our careers.
I love that. So I'm going to ask you when we get done here to give me the link to that so we can put that in the show notes, and we'll have that for all of you there. So, one last question for you, Gene, the one you probably most wanted me to ask from the very beginning. Where can people learn more? Where do you want to point them to for the book? Anything at all about connecting with you, getting linked up with your work?
Absolutely. Just go to books are available. Wearing the Winning Organization at your favorite book retailer. And if you want to learn more about the work I'm doing, just go to itrevolution.com. So that's itrevolution.com. And you can certainly hit me up on LinkedIn and your favorite social media of choice.
There you go, itrevolution.com. So now, everybody, before we go, I have a question for all of you that I ask you every single episode, and it is this. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of listening to Gene and I's conversation? What idea will you go implement? Maybe your idea is to think about what's the system that we need to work to slowify? Maybe you've gotten some insights about thinking about the role of planning and practice for your team or for yourself. Maybe you're taking this ideas for you personally or for you as a leader, maybe for both. I don't know what your actions are, but I do know that if you take action, you'll get far more from this last 30 minutes than you would have otherwise. So with that, I will say thank you, Gene, for joining me. It was a pleasure to have you. And thanks again for your good work and for joining us today.
Kevin, thank you so much. Right back at you. Keep up the amazing work.
All right, everybody. That's the last of this episode, but we'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Join us then, and make sure you like, subscribe, share. You know what to do wherever you happen to be watching or listening to this podcast. Do that, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.